Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you feel that way. Not everybody does. Well, welcome class. Good to see y'all today. So, doesn't matter how many are out there. I kind of go through the same shtick, if you will. I just say, well, it's good to see everybody. So not so many everybody's today, but that's okay. I do believe folks are watching online and tape or video delay. So I do making sure that we do link to the videos as they're produced from Blackboard. So I try to take care of that. Okay, so here we are. Okay, I like to observe the milepost in this class. I think this is week 13. It's 12 or 13. It might be 12. I mean, it's 12. Yeah, I think it's week 12. So I believe it is. Come to think of it. So, at any rate, we're in chapter 13, and we're finishing it. We will finish it today. That's my intent. Maybe look a little bit at the last topic we'll do in this course. So right now we're on oligopoly. We've been talking about this fourth market structure under our purview here, oligopoly. So we've talked about perfect competition, monopoly, and monopolistic competition. So this is our second day, I believe, on oligopoly, and we covered quite a bit of material last time. I want to just make sure we're kind of sum that up. And then we will do probably our last topic. I want to get over into resource markets before the course is over. Very important topic. We've, to this point, kind of confined ourselves to product markets, okay? So, but of course you have resource markets too. If you think back to the circular flow that we looked at earlier in the course, hey Andres, there was the top, I forget, that was chapter 1 or 2, but if you go back and look at the circular flow, you'll see again the top part of that loop illustrated there deals with product markets. And it's the bottom part of the loop where we look at resource markets, where the role of the buyer and the seller that we typically associate in the product market with firms and households respectively. Firms are sellers and households are buyers in product markets. We reverse those roles in resource markets. And so we'll talk about the market for labor, say, okay, where you as a household, you sell labor, okay? And why would you sell your labor at $10 an hour and not $5 an hour and so forth? So those are things we'll look at during the balance of the semester, okay, which is not much, okay? So at any rate, the end draweth nigh. Sound like an Old Testament prophet, I guess. But I hope the Babylonians aren't at the gate. So anyway, so let's look again in chapter 13. I want to kind of summarize first off what we talked about last time. Basically, there are 3 oligopoly models, okay? And I wrote some of this down for my own edification here, but perhaps this will help you too. Your book on page 265, at least that's in my edition of the text, mentions 3 oligopoly models, okay? Here they are. Whoa. Okay, so I'm not sure, I don't think we quite did it in this order. We did number 2 first. When we looked at collusive behavior or collusive pricing, we'll come back and just talk about that here again a little bit. I'm going to loop back around because there's quite a bit in chapter 13. We didn't spend a lot of time in chapter 14, but chapter 13, I want to spend a little more time. There's a little more detail when you talk about oligopoly, and we'll see some reasons why here in a minute. But we kind of began with number 2 last time when we talked about collusive pricing. In an oligopoly, there's always the tendency, or frequently the tendency for the players in an oligopoly to collude. That is, to engage in price fixing or market distribution, allocation, or so forth. That's what OPEC does. Use that a lot. It's a cartel. When we hear the word cartel a lot in the news today, we think of drug cartels, right? But I mean, cartel, the definition of cartel is a little broader than what we kind of identify in that situation. A cartel is a club where the members of the club, the sellers, if you will, have a mutual agreement to respect each other's territory, if you will. So the mob used to have like a cartel in New York City. I don't know to what extent they still do and so forth, but I got to speak with one of the prosecutors in the Whitey Bulger case, not a couple years ago. Neat guy, was from our hometown. He's a district attorney, and he's no longer with us. Really wonderful man, but you start talking with these people. I've talked with others who've been in, who've had to confront that environment, and you realize that in some of these big cities, it could be Chicago, some of the other cities, Detroit and so forth, you got an organization. And you got multiple organizations, but there's an organization of organizations, if you will. And the members of that umbrella organization, they respect each other's territory. So you call this a cartel, where the members respect each other's territory. With OPEC, the oil-producing, exporting countries, it's a multinational cartel. The members set quotas for the production and delivery of oil to the global markets. So they agree on this sort of thing. They come together, they hammer it out. In the U.S., within the confines of our borders, that would be illegal. That would be antitrust. And it's not legal for Shell Oil and Texaco and ExxonMobil, what have you, to come together and fix prices or say, hey, you can operate in California, we'll stay out, and so forth, to allot the market between themselves. That's antitrust behavior. We wouldn't allow that in the U.S. But on the global stage, between sovereign countries like you have in OPEC, there's 13 countries. Who's going to tell them they can't collude? So they do. At any rate, collusive pricing is one of these two models. We saw how with the prisoner's dilemma, and I hope you remember that, okay? There's so much more we could talk about the prisoner's dilemma, but the prisoner's dilemma illustrates a challenge for this type of behavior, for collusive pricing. Now, I'll come back to this here in a second, but if an oligopoly, say a cartel, could do this, they would act as a monopoly. They would all agree at the same time to do the same thing. So, when OPEC comes together and they all agree to restrict their output, what they're trying to do is raise the price of oil. And if they all together can achieve that, then they're acting like a monopoly. And the monopoly model really applies there in large extent to a cartel, where there is some sort of mutual enforcement. But if there's not mutual enforcement of the agreement, then there's always the incentive to cheat. Okay, in cartels like OPEC, especially with OPEC, cheating takes on this form. Cheating means that when the ministers break from the meeting, each one goes back home and says, hey, we agreed to restrict output to drive up the world price of oil. So we got the price up there. Let's produce a little more than we said we would in the agreement. And we can clean up. And if you're the only country that does that, well, that's cool. I mean, you really do. But the problem is there's 13 countries here. They all have the same incentives that you do if you're from Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or what have you. So they all have an incentive to cheat. And if they all cheated, then you wind up with the price of oil going back down pretty soon. That's kind of the history of OPEC meetings. They all cheat. The prisoner's dilemma illustrates this problem that's endemic to cartels. Thelma and Louise, if they could enforce an agreement between themselves, would each only get 1 year in prison. You go back and look at that payoff matrix. And they say, I won't confess to this bigger crime if you don't. They'd only get 1 year, a total of 2 years between them in prison, which is the optimal for this little group. But alas, they don't trust each other. because the DA has sequestered them. And they can't stare at each other in the same room and threaten each other, at least with facial expressions and so forth. So they each cheat in that they take the DA's deal to confess to this larger crime. And when they do, they wind up together spending 4 years in prison. So if you go back and look at that payoff matrix, I hope this makes sense, that they each make a calculation that regardless of what their opponent does or their partner does, they're always better off if they welch on this agreement that they may have made on their way down to headquarters in the back of the squad car. You know, there's always an incentive to cheat. That's okay. So enough for now of collusive pricing. If the members could enforce the agreement amongst themselves, they would essentially be, a cartel would essentially be a monopoly. Okay, and we've looked at the model for monopolies and so forth. Okay, but they can't. Okay, so the prisoner's dilemma illustrates the downside of that particular structure. Okay, the other model, the first one here I mentioned here, is called the kink demand curve. And it's built on a different behavioral assumption. The kink demand curve is built on the assumption that if you belong to the club and you raise your prices, your competitors are going to let you go ahead and raise your price because you're going to lose market share if that happens. So the first person to stick their neck out a little bit by raising the price finds themselves alone. Okay, so we see this kind of behavior a lot in oligopolies. Let me tell you that it's a justification of the reason why you see stable prices and stable market quantities traded in like the breakfast cereal oligopoly and big soda, soft drink industry and so forth. We've got a few major players that dominate the landscape. You know, the price of soda, I say soda or soda pop, is not very volatile, right? It's just kind of very stationary. And the reason is no one's going to stick their neck out by raising their prices. Because if they do, the likelihood of them being the only one is very high. Okay, so this behavioral assumption that I've alluded to that kind of characterizes the kink demand curve is that a price increase will not be matched by rivals, but a price decrease will be. And so let me see if I can find that here, a picture of the kink demand curve as we mentioned it in the book. Let's see here, it's on page, I'm in the wrong chapter here. I want you to see it, though, again, because we kind of left off on this a little bit. We were talking about the kink demand curve as our second model of oligopoly behavior. So this is on page 266 of your text. And the idea again is we have a different behavioral assumption here. Collusion's really not possible here. There's no way to police the members of the oligopoly and say, if we raise our prices, so will you. If that were the case, and we had a monopoly here, as I said, that characterizes a successful cartel, then this straight line here would be the industry demand curve, would face the monopolist, right? We've seen that before. Each firm would face a linear demand curve, and correspondingly a linear marginal revenue curve with twice the slope. You remember that, right? I mean, the only thing different here with these two curves here is it says D1 here. This is the demand curve that faces firm number one. You got firm number two and so forth. But the idea is if all the firms act together, they can police an agreement amongst themselves, then yes, it's like a monopoly. It's like the industry's like a monopoly. So what faces each firm will look like monopoly pricing here. Remember with a monopolist, the individual demand curve, well, for a monopolist it's the market demand curve, but is a straight line. Marginal revenue is twice as steep, and so we looked at that dynamic. But the problem with, again, an oligopoly so frequently is, and that's modeled by the kink demand curve, is that price increases are not matched. So really, wherever the price is, it puts this little kink in the demand curve. So it's more elastic. The demand is more elastic, price elastic in this region. So if you are one of the soda companies or what have you, and you raise your price a little bit, you go along this segment here, you lose a lot of market share, okay? Because your buddies in the club are going to say, bye-bye. That's okay, you know, it's just the way it goes. If you lower your price, so you're point A and the price is P sub 0 here, and you lower your price, then that gets matched. So the industry will grow if the industry lowers its price, but it could be that the market shares don't change, okay? Everybody splits it 1/4, 1/4. Okay, I tell you, I ran for office once, and the 4 candidates all got 25% of the vote. It's just I got 24.2% or something. But, I mean, that can happen. That's kind of a wild thing. You could have 4 firms that divide up the market. Well, if they lower their price, yes, the size of the market will grow, but the shares may not necessarily be changed, okay? It's just kind of illustrate there. So you grow, but not as much as you would lose up here if you step out on the limb by yourself. So the individual demand curve for a firm in an oligopoly under this model, the kink demand curve, has to have this little kink in it right here. The elasticities above the market price is different than the elasticity, price elasticity below. And so consequently it puts this, well, you see it over here, it puts this gap in the marginal revenue curve. Okay, because you can trace these two back to a common point, and that's kind of the point of this picture right here, trace these two back. Marginal revenue is always twice as steep as the demand curve. So at any rate, so the marginal cost curve can move up and down. The cost of production can go up and down, okay? Not affect these two things, the quantity traded, nor the price, which is up here on the demand curve. So I mentioned, you know, by analogy here, as a car has great shock absorbers on it, it's driving on a country road, you might follow it here, and you might see those wheels wobble all over the place. But the people in the car, you know, if it's a really fancy car and so forth, they're still sipping tea, okay? Because the car is in place, the wheels are all over the place. So the point is the marginal cost can bounce up and down. The price of oats can go up and down, but which is an input. You know, part of the marginal cost of producing a breakfast cereal. Cheerios is oats, right? The price of Cheerios is pretty stable on the shelf. That's pretty stable. That's the output for the oligopoly. So it's just kind of sitting there, whereas the price of an input can go up and down. This is a phenomenon that's been observed to characterize an oligopoly quite a bit. Price stability. It seems to be something we can marshal in favor of the kink demand curve, okay, that we see a lot of price stability. Okay, now I mentioned this is where we left off last time, so a lot of that was, the prologue today was review, and I hope that's okay. The theory sounds great and all, but it doesn't explain why the price is here in the first place, okay? The kink demand theory accepts this price and it goes on from there, but it doesn't explain why the price is there in the first place. So this is the first shortcoming, if you will, of the kink demand model, okay? It does not explain how the firm's selling price got to P sub 0 in the first place. Another thing is that when the macroeconomy is unstable, like during a recession, a severe recession, or an expansion even, an inflationary stage, prices are not as stable for any good as the kink demand model might suggest. Okay, this just suggests that, man, no matter, I mean, there's this big gap here because these elasticities are markedly different. And evidence seems to suggest that while this is a beautiful theory, you know, it kind of breaks down during periods of recession and so forth. So think about a recession for a little bit. And if you think about oligopolies and so forth, a club of just a few players, maybe the airline industry, something like that, during a recession, then it doesn't really take a whole lot to precipitate a price war, okay? A price war. I remember in the town I grew up, way back there were just a few, I call them gasoline stations back then, but it kind of had an oligopoly behavior there, and those had some Back then, the gasoline stations, had some degree of independence where they could set their own prices. So you kind of had an oligopoly here. But once in a while, there'd be a price war. Something would trigger a price war where, it becomes obvious when you watch those prices go down. By the way, I got to have something to brag about. So I brag about my age sometimes. I'm so old. I'm old as dirt, okay? But I remember buying gasoline at 22 cents a gallon, okay? That's how old I am. We lived out in the country, and way up on the highway, there was a gasoline station. I'd go up there and fill my can up, come back. I'd either fill up my motorcycle or I'd fill up the lawnmower. But I knew, watch the price. But at any rate, in that area, there weren't that many gasoline stations, but they would engage in a price war. And I believe I once saw the price of gasoline get down to as low as 18 cents a gallon during a price war. Now, I'm not sure how much of that would be legal today, because there's a certain predatory element there. It's called predatory pricing, if you will, and you hear that more today, like predatory loans. Interest rates so low, you're victimized if you take out a loan. It's like the bank chased you down and they just offered you something you couldn't refuse, make you an offer you couldn't refuse. Called predatory pricing or what have you. Well, you kind of had that sort of thing back there with gas wars. It was obvious, I guess, they were lowering the price to get your business away from someone else, put someone out of the club. Okay, so there was this vindictive or spiteful element to price wars. You have price wars still. Today, to some degree, you have it in the airline industry, as I mentioned, and you have it in the petroleum industry and so forth. That seems to just be a fact that flies in the face of the kink demand curve, because the kink demand curve model kind of suggests that the price of whatever the commodity is just sitting there, even though the marginal cost of producing that commodity can be all over the place. So those are the two shortcomings. You should know the two shortcomings. Okay, it doesn't explain, again, the model does not explain why there's a price at P sub 0 to start with, and then it does not explain the volatility in prices in oligopolies that we do in fact observe. Okay, they're not as stable as the kink demand theory would suggest. Okay, so there's the two models there, okay? They're kind of bouncing back and forth a little bit here. There's the collusive pricing model again, and there's the kink demand theory model. We've observed collusive pricing a lot, even in recent years. I mean, you don't have to go back in history, so I'm kind of going back to that a little bit, just kind of bounce back and forth. But with collusive pricing, Apple had this thing going with certain book publishers just in 2015 to fix ebook prices. Okay, I think your book talks about that a little bit. Volkswagen and BMW were fined in 2019 for slow walking pollution control devices in their automobiles. And how this was enforced or agreed upon, I don't know, but BMW and Volkswagen, I just haven't read much about it. But, in some subtle way, we're able to encourage each other, I'm going to put that off if you put that off. And the idea was that the regulators would not do anything about it because between these two companies, there was just too much power to take on. Credit Suisse, Bank of America, Credit Agricole, rigged bond trades in 2021 and so forth. I mentioned General Electric and Westinghouse last time, back in, I believe it was in the 30s, how they had kind of a gentleman's agreement to submit bids to the Tennessee Valley Authority that would step the price up as they exchanged between themselves the honor of being the low bidder. Okay, so I might go back. They were, I think, providing generators to the Tennessee Valley Authority. I guess they use a lot of these generators. And Westinghouse would submit the low bid during this phase of the moon, and regulators observed that, well, in another phase of the moon, it seemed like Westinghouse was the high bid and General Electric was the low bid. And so you had this price-fixing behavior over time that ratcheted up the price of a good that these companies were making and selling. So as there were, as we say, obstacles to the kink demand theory, your book talks about obstacles to collusion. You know, they, again, the most salient of these, I think, most conspicuous is the prisoner's dilemma situation. There's just always the incentive to cheat. But there's always also the prospect of potential entry, okay? So if two firms are engaged in trying to fix prices and so forth, another firm may come in and get some of the market share. So there's that. And there's also a lot of times just differences in production cost and demand for their particular product. So General Electric and Westinghouse say, maybe, I don't know, we're able to each make this generator here at about the same cost. But if one company is a lot bigger than the other and so forth, can take advantage of economies of scale, and then it could produce that generator much cheaply, perhaps. Marginal cost would be the average cost would be lower. So it could produce that much cheaper. And so if you have a disparity in the cost, manufacturing cost associated with delivery of the good, then that can be an obstacle to collusion. Okay, I think you can see why, right? The one that has a cost advantage can underprice its rival, so forth. Other obstacles to collusion, obviously, is that we have antitrust laws in the U.S. that prevent these things. Okay. All right, so those are the two models we looked at we introduced both last time. I've spent here 26 minutes just kind of recapping that, I've beaten it, is that a word? I beat it into the wall. So we need to get to the third model, and then we'll do something else. So the third model is the price leadership model. Okay, now I don't really have a neat diagram for the price leadership model, that I did for the other two. The kink demand, I love that diagram. And for collusive pricing, you got the monopoly diagram, really. Okay, each has their own behavioral assumption. Collusive pricing breaks down, though, when people cheat. But here I don't really have a nice diagram. You can get mathematical on this, but this is more heuristic, okay? I just got some anecdotal, if you will. Just got some examples. I think we see from the term price leadership, it's probably obvious what this model implies, is that there's a dominant firm, usually the largest or the most efficient, that initiates the price changes, say a price increase or price decrease, either one, and all the other firms generally follow suit. So what I mean by this is you have like Apple in the smartphone market. Okay, so if Apple changes the price of their smartphone or what have you, comes out with a better deal, then they kind of lead the industry. And there's these other companies that make smartphones that will follow in their wake. Or Walmart, okay, is a price leader. We all know that. They just advertise as a price leader, but they have market dominance in the grocery industry for sure. So if Walmart lowers their price on on canned goods and so forth, all the other grocery stores around, they're going to feel kind of pressure to do the same. Because if they don't, then, I don't know, y'all aren't old enough to remember Ross Perot. You remember Ross Perot? He talked about all the jobs were going to go to Mexico in 1992 because of NAFTA. He said there's this giant sucking sound in Mexico. It's going to suck all the jobs out of the U.S. Well, you kind of have the same thing. If Walmart were to lower their prices and the grocery stores don't respond in kind, guess what? They start to belly up, okay? And, there used to be lots of corner grocery stores, corner druggists, corner hardware stores, mom and pop outfits. Used to be flower boutiques or flower shops here and there. Small town America used to be populated, You go downtown, you would see these different, you'd see a mercantile here, you'd see these things. You'd even see a barber shop. And he said, we still have these things, but not to the extent that we used to, because a lot of people, I guess, they get their hair cut even in Walmart. They even do their banking at Walmart and so forth. I mean, Walmart's not a bank. Well, there's Arvest, but that's a different story there. But you know, a bank may set up shop in Walmart. The thing is, Walmart's become the new town square, if you will, and you just can't. They dominate so many markets. They certainly dominate the grocery industry. So when they talk about their low prices, I'll guarantee you, the smaller grocery stores in town will pay attention to that. It's called price leadership. They are the leader. In airlines, you might have certain carriers like Delta, or especially like Southwest Airlines, and then you got some of these commuter airlines and so forth, but that will set low prices, and this really pressures the other airlines. Okay, they're leaders in their particular market. I would think Southwest Airlines, and I don't fly that much anymore. I used to fly a lot, and I don't fly anymore. My job doesn't require it. So. But you have a leader that forces the other rivals to follow suit. Say with printers, like computer printers, you got Canon and Epson. Okay, and I'm not sure which is the biggest firm there, but kind of like two firms there are the leaders in that industry. So if you don't have Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, then you've got two giants and six dwarfs or what have you that would describe the industry. In farm machinery, your book gives some illustrations there. Price leadership existing in that industry. Cement, copper, newsprint, glass containers, steel, beer, cigarettes, and tin. Okay, so I don't know beer, for instance. I'm not it's okay if you are. I'm not trying to make a point on this, but I don't drink beer, okay? I just never liked the stuff. But I think, when I think of beer, Anheuser-Busch, right? And it's like they're going to be the leader probably, or maybe, you know, one of the others. So other firms, even like Heineken that might come in from Holland or something, I don't know, I'm revealing my ignorance, but they're going to pay attention to the prices that are set by the leader in the United States when they show up on the shelf here, so forth. So the price leader has a certain behavior too, okay? Just the leader. Whoever the leader is, they generally change prices only infrequently. Not very often. And when they do, they tend to publish their intent. Okay, you get a lot of noise in these industries when they plan to raise or lower the price of their good. Okay, just saying. And they may do so. They may change prices because of your book mentions like three things. It could be more than this, but sometimes there may be an industry-wide wage increase. So everybody who works in the beer industry, okay, brewers, you know, they got to have a certain skill set there, may clamor there for a pay raise. And if they're successful in doing that, then it may result in the industry saying, hey, we got to raise the price. Okay, so it could be because of wage increases of workers in that particular industry. Could be because of increase in excise taxes. Okay, so you certainly have excise taxes in beer, don't you? In alcoholic beverages, there's per unit taxes. Just look on one of those bottles and it'll talk about it. Okay, and we've talked about why that exists, or we did that earlier in the course. Or if there's just an increase in some other input price, okay? Ultimately, if it's big enough, that has to be passed, to some extent, passed on to the consumer. So these announcements that'll be made by the price leader, the dominant firm, will be a result of something that's affecting their cost of doing business. Okay. You also have what's called limit pricing that occurs in this particular model here, where you have a dominant firm or a couple of dominant firms. Again, this is our third model, price leadership. So you have a price leader. And when you have that situation, that firm may engage in limit pricing. So what in the world is that? Well, limit pricing is something that a big firm can use because they have economies of scale. And if they grow larger because of economies of scale, they can reduce their cost of delivering a unit to the market. So limit pricing is the establishment or the establishing of a price low enough to block the entry of new firms. That's kind of what we had with the price war thing, okay, just a moment ago. If you're big, then you can lower the price. In fact, the bigger you are, if you got economies of scale, the lower you can price. And you may engage in that kind of behavior simply to put your rivals out of business. This is called limit pricing. It's the setting of a price low enough to block entries of new firms, mainly to block entries of new firms, but also might be to run out some of the established firms. Okay. So smaller firms may not be able to deliver that car battery to the shelf at a low price like Delco can or what have you, because Delco has these economies of scale. Okay, so that kind of goes with the price wars thing, I think. But again, with this model, the idea is you don't have like 8 firms, each have 12.5% of the market. That's not a price leadership, okay, because they're all of the same size. It's an oligopoly. What we're talking about here is an oligopoly that has a dominant firm, maybe 80% of the market, and there's 5 other firms that share the other 20%. So that's highly concentrated, very highly concentrated. So that kind of leads us to the next point here. Okay, so those are the 3 models. I want you to be aware of the 3 models. Read your book on this. There's some detail here I didn't cover. But this kind of leads us basically to the overall problem when we start talking about oligopolies. Is why do we have 3 models? Okay, so there's 3 models. Why are there 3 models? We didn't have 3 models for monopoly. We didn't have we had 1 model. We kind of had 1 model for perfect competition, but we feel like we need to have these different models when we start talking about oligopoly. And the reason is because there's such a variegated or differentiated set of firms that may typify a oligopoly, an oligopoly. So you might have, again, 8 firms of equal size, but then you might have 2 firms that are really big and 6 firms that are much smaller, and they kind of split the remaining part of the market. Both of those are oligopolies. Okay, both of them have 8 firms, but the distribution of the market shares are so much different that there's likely to be differing, at least behavioral assumptions that characterize the dynamic that occurs amongst the players. So if you think for a minute like, okay, so the price leadership model obviously is more appropriate for an oligopoly that it's highly concentrated oligopoly where you got 1 firm, Walmart, highly concentrated, in big box retail or something, or grocery. Certainly in grocery. In my hometown, there's a couple of other grocery stores. My hometown of 50,000 people, there's a couple other stores. Pardon me, I'm still trying to get over this cold or something. I got something last week. I moan about it on one of these videos I made. I forget. But anyway, hopefully, it wasn't in this class. But so you're going to have a different behavioral assumption there, okay? The behavioral assumption there is that there's one firm that kind of sets a standard for everybody, kind of forces everybody else's hand. But if you had a more equally distributed oligopoly, not more firms necessarily, but the market shares are more equal, then it could be that this kink demand curve model is more appropriate. The behavioral assumption there again is that no one wants to stick their head up first. We really do. The price of oats has been going up. We really do need to raise our price. but I don't want to be the first one to do it. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Okay, if you have a lot of brothers and sisters, maybe you've been in that situation. You don't want to be the one to go tell mom and dad that my wife grew up in a home with 8 kids. I think it was 8 kids. So she was the youngest, but I've heard her talk about it a little bit. But, they would kind of all collude. There were instances, and I don't want to tell too much here, but instances where they'd all collude and be involved in something probably they shouldn't have been involved in, and something bad would happen. You didn't want to be the one to have to go admit. You didn't want to be the bearer of bad news. So that's kind of the situation with the price leadership model. You don't want to be the one to raise your prices because you're going to get your head cut off, even though the industry probably should. Okay, so again, the way the market shares are distributed amongst a small club will affect kind of the behavioral assumption we can apply there, okay? So if it's small in number, didn't want to say this, if there's not very many firms, then the collusive pricing model may work. Now it'll break down if you can't enforce the agreement. But OPEC has 13 countries. They can't seem to enforce the agreement most of the time. But if there were only 4 countries, maybe they could. Okay? Maybe they could. So in that case, the 4 would act as a monopoly. So I hope you see, just apply your common sense here. If there's fewer firms, there's more likely to be collusion. More firms, there's less likely to be collusion. When there's collusion, the market, the supply side of the market acts like a monopoly. Okay? So forth. If there's more firms, then you're getting more into this kink demand curve situation. Unless one of the firms is the big one, and then you're in the price leadership situation. So, again, I hope your head's not spinning. Okay, wow, Dr. Che, you're throwing all this stuff at us. And you want to read the chapter. By the way, let me say this. There's good and bad news here, okay? I'll say you want to read, it's really incumbent on you to read this chapter. That's, I guess I'll say the bad news for you. It's not too many pages. Read this because there's so much detail when you get to oligopoly. As you see, it's a more complicated, it's a broader set of circumstances that we look at. You have differentiated products, you have homogeneous products, okay? And so forth. We mentioned that last time when we kicked this off. So read the chapter. That's the bad news, I guess. Got to read the chapter. The good news is you don't have to read the whole chapter, okay? You do not have to read the whole chapter. Let me say that you can stop when it gets heavy into the game theory. Okay, that's section 3 in this chapter, 13.3. They talk about game theory and strategic behavior. I wanted to introduce you to that. The prisoner's dilemma. You should kind of know, go back and look at that payoff matrix. Did everybody, I hope you spend some time with this thing. You should know which square is the equilibrium. We called it a Nash equilibrium, but there's a little more to it than that. But this was the Thelma and Louise thing. I'll hold up to the camera there. Thelma and Louise. And so that payoff matrix, understand kind of how that drives the game to that one square. And just real quick here, I don't mean to belabor this too much, but I gave you this, we looked at it. So we did a little game theory here, and that's all you need to know. And that's 50 years from now, if we're still around. I won't be alive, but you will be. And you look back on this course, hopefully you'll chuckle a little bit when you think of the prisoner's dilemma. Actually, a while ago, kind of at lunch, I saw my brother, and he's here at the university too, and I said, hey, I showed him the prisoner's dilemma last time. We both kind of laughed about it. We always, over the years, had a little fun with it. The prisoner's dilemma, I hope you look back on this 50 years from now and see how the game, because each firm has a dominant strategy, winds up in this square here, where between them they're serving 4 years in prison, when this would have been a better outcome. But alas, they cannot enforce an agreement amongst themselves. So often that's the case with a cartel. Okay, enough, but we did some game theory. We did enough. We don't need to do repeated games. So they talk about repeated gains on page 276. Read this if you want. They talk about first mover advantages and preemption of entry. All of this stuff is mentioned in the balance of the chapter. So end your reading at the beginning of 13.3. Any questions, class? You got any questions? Make sure. So I know I spent a lot of time on this. I try to be thorough because it's interesting, okay? I'm not just trying to. It's really interesting when you get into this. We could look at a few of these discussion questions just to make sure. Now, I have given you guys and gals here some assignments here on the review questions. So try these. If you have any problems with these, let me know, okay? These are all really good questions, and they're not hard, okay? Probably pretty soon, my intent is to post some additional review questions that aren't in the book, but questions that will prepare you for the exam, the final exam, which is fastly approaching. And so for this, I want to give you a few more questions over chapter 13, okay? I like this book, but if it can be faulted for anything, in my mind, it's that they don't give you very many problems. I mean, look at this. There's only 8 problems here. This is the next page here. Here's 8 problems here. And we're not even going to touch advanced analysis here. So I say there's 8. I don't know. Review questions, there's 8 review questions. And there's like 3 problems worth working. So at any rate, I have to supplement that, and I will to prepare you for the exam. Okay. But we can look at these discussion questions together, just a little bit. I'm not very good at facilitating discussion sometimes. But. Okay, so you should, we don't necessarily have to do these here, but I just mentioned this. Number 2, what is the meaning of a 4-firm concentration ratio of 60%? Okay. So it means the top 4 firms account for 60% of the market. If that's the case, could you have 2 industries each that have a 60% 4-firm concentration ratio, but would have different Herfindahl indices? Does that make sense? Okay. So the shortcoming of the 4-firm, say the 4-firm concentration ratio, is it doesn't tell you about the entire industry. So here with 60%, you might have 4 firms accounting for 60%. Well, what about the other 40% of the market? Is that gobbled up by, 5 firms or 10 firms or what have you? The idea that, I would say that on average, on average, if the 4-firm concentration ratio is 60%, then on average, the firms that account for that have 15% of the market, right? So there's 40% of the market left over. You could have 4 firms that have 10%, okay? Or you could have 400 firms, I guess, or 40 firms that have 1%. Okay, the difference there, right? So you could have 4 firms that share what's left over, the 40%, or you could have 40 firms that each have 1%. And of course, that's going to affect the Herfindahl index. The first one I described would have a higher Herfindahl index. The more concentrated the market is, the higher the Herfindahl index. So you want to look at that too, okay? Okay, so make sure you understand that. Again, these are kind of questions you'd expect on the test, and I don't mean to drag my feet here a little bit today, but I'm not quite ready for us to lunge headlong into resource markets. So I just want to introduce that a little today, but I want to recap this here, make sure before we go there, we can answer these basic questions like what assumptions about a rival's response to price changes underlie the kink demand curve. Okay, so we've belabored this point, but price increases will not be matched, price decreases will be, okay? How does the kink demand curve explain price rigidity in an oligopoly? So you should understand that. It's because the kink in the demand curve produces a gap in the marginal revenue curve, which gives this broad range within which the marginal cost curve can bounce up and down and has no effect on product price. or quantity traded. Why is there, and here's a good one. Now, I haven't really spent much time on this. Why is there so much advertising in these two last market structures we looked at, say oligopoly and monopolistic competition? There's a lot of advertising. Your book spends some time on this. Somebody spilt some ink on this thing, beginning on page 272. I took a lot of notes here. But they talk about oligopoly, and advertising. There's a lot of advertising that goes on in oligopoly. So your book talks about this, okay? And now you think about it just a second. Say with the kink demand, the behavioral assumption under the kink demand curve is that nobody wants to be alone by raising their prices. So there's this hesitance to engage in competing on price. Firms want to steer away from competing on price. Okay? If you lower your price, well, you might get a lot more market, but guess what? Under the kink demand theory, that means it's going to get matched. So if you lower your price, your rivals are going to match it. And so it might eventually, to some degree, it will at least temper, if not completely, nullify what you set out to do in the first place. You might get more entrants to come in and so forth if you start tinkering with the price. So at any rate, advertising is another way to compete without trying to do so on price. So firms come together. So you get a lot of ads. There's a lot of national ads for oil companies and even commercial aircraft manufacturers. So I think I'm not going to go out and buy a 747 tomorrow, or I'm not going to go buy a fighter jet. I always thought this kind of funny. Lockheed Martin or General Dynamics, something, Lockheed Martin, might have an ad on TV. They run these ads, and they'll show you the F whatever it is fighter. Wow, I'm probably not going to go buy one of those, right? So who's this ad directed to, right? Who is this? It's directed to someone. It's a way of competing, perhaps, for the big countries out there that might buy these armaments and so forth. But it's a way of competing, but not on price. Okay, so you get lots of ads that are associated with oligopolies. So whether we're talking about banking, whether we're talking about petroleum, automobile manufacturers. Now there you go. Now there you really go. Okay. Now once in a while, I don't watch a whole lot of TV, but if it's a local dealership, I hear more about price. Then I'll hear in an ad from the national company that makes the automobile. So Buick, they'll run an ad and they may say, buy a Buick today and you get 10% off the MSRP or what have you. But a lot of times, generally what they're doing is they're putting you in the driver's seat and they're showing you how luxurious the automobile is and how you can float down. Man, that's what they're trying to do. They're not competing on price so much. You've got a lot of non-price competition in an industry like the automobile manufacturing industry, where they're advertising a lot to convince you that, Coke is the real thing. Okay? Or you want to buy Chevy because Chevy's like apple pie, baseball apple pie. What was the other? Baseball, apple pie, something Chevrolet that makes America great. So do your patriotic duty and buy a Chevrolet. So don't buy Chevrolet because it's cheaper than a Toyota. All right? So at any rate, I'm being a little facetious here. Thanks for bearing with me today, but you got that going on in oligopolies. Now, advertising, then we see, can be good for the broader economy or for the planet, if you will, or it can be bad. Advertising performs an information clearing function. If it weren't for advertising, then I wouldn't want to go buy a car. The search costs would be tremendous. Generally, and I don't buy a new car very often, but over the years I've bought a few. I'm I'll be prompted to do so because I've watched an ad somewhere. There's been an ad affect me. And I've learned something from the ads. I try to be discriminating about it, and you have to be with advertising. But advertising performs an information clearing function, if you will. We are all able to make more efficient decisions because we get information through ads, okay? So it allows you to make efficient decisions. It also reduces, advertising can reduce monopoly power that's enjoyed by the dominant firms in an industry. If another firm can come in and get an ad on TV, then it makes the playing field more level. So there are good things about advertising, okay? You may not be able to compete on price, but maybe you can get on TV with a slick ad. But your book also talks here about negative. See how I mark up my book here? So potential negative effects of advertising. And I wrote this word here, manipulation. Okay, that's all I need to say, hey, a lot of ads are manipulative. Okay, you got to be careful. False advertising may be illegal in our country, but they can still be manipulative. Still be legal, but manipulative. You guys who watch TV more than I do probably understand that. Ads also employ a lot of popular personalities. So just because Shaquille O'Neal says that I need to buy this particular pickup truck, doesn't necessarily mean he's an expert on pickup trucks, okay? A lot of times we defer to these personalities, these popular personalities, when if we stood back and looked at it a little bit, we'd say, well, they're not, why would they know any more than I would know? But can y'all think of any, is there any ads that strike y'all that way? I don't watch very much TV. But have you ever found yourself watching TV, an ad on TV, and you go, that's a famous person there telling me to buy good X, but why would they know any more about that good than I would know? Why should I listen to them? Okay, I'll probably tonight I'll sit up in bed at 2 o'clock in the morning. There's an excellent example. Okay, I don't have many because I don't watch TV. I say I don't watch TV. I watch a little bit, but I don't. I like to tell people, now you're going to really think this is weird. So, this is just one of those days, right? But I quit watching TV in 1972. So that's a famous watershed year in television history. 1972, they canceled a lot of very popular sitcoms and so forth. And there was a paradigm shift, really. So suddenly you had the Love Boat on TV and this and that. And I quit watching TV. I was young, so I haven't watched. But I watch news. Okay, I watch TV for information, but not for entertainment. I rarely watch TV for entertainment. But maybe you do, and that's okay if you do. And you know some of these stars, and, and so forth. I guess I need to get a life is what I need to do. Advertising can be manipulative, okay? And a lot of times they use famous personalities to manipulate your behavior. They can enhance brand name loyalty and create market or monopoly power. Okay, so, there's some jingles. I wrote them down last time. I had to look them up. I used the ones. I don't have it with me here today, but Sara Lee is the one I used. Everybody doesn't like something, but nobody doesn't like Sara Lee. I always thought that was a kind of a clever little jingle. So if my wife sends me off to buy some sort of dessert cake for the family get-together that's coming up, I'm going to grab Sara Lee, okay, because I was affected by that. What's interesting about that is that if you get into accounting a little bit, accounting principles, generally accepted accounting principles, generally require companies to expense or report on their income statement expenses that generate income in the same year, or generate revenue. Revenue minus expenses is income. So if you that's why you depreciate a roof. So if you put a 20-year asset say a roof that's going to last 30 years, you'll move 1/30 of the cost to the income statement each year. They call that expensing. okay? Because it generates revenue. Okay, well, that may sound technical and so forth. If you've had any accounting, it makes sense to you. There's a reason why you do that, so the bottom line is not manipulated. But when it comes to advertising, you got a different thing. A roof may generate revenue over 30 years, so you may parcel out the cost of a roof on your income statement over 30 different years because it's generating revenue over 30 different years. But when it comes to advertising and accounting, you treat that cost completely different. Because there's no way of knowing. I still remember Where's the Beef, which was another oligopoly, fast food, burger, okay? Where's the Beef? That was Wendy's, I think. And I think of that to this day. It has affected me today, though that ad has not been on the TV in 30 years. But I still might go to Wendy's and buy a hamburger because of that ad. It affects me to this day. And the point is, unlike a roof where you parcel it out over the years it's of useful life to you on your income statements, generally accepted accounting principle says you got to put all that cost in the year in which it's incurred. So if you have $1 million ad campaign this year, it might affect people for years to come. You got to report all of that as an expense in the current year. So it's just something, if you do any basic accounting, you'll encounter that, okay? All right. Okay, I think that pretty well does it for oligopoly. Okay, so it's been an hour here summing things up. I hope that's helpful. Now, we will skip chapter 14 because it was interesting. It talks about the internet economy and so forth. That would be great. Network effects, but alas, we just don't have time. And we are going to go next to talk about the demand for resources, resource markets. So this is chapter 16. So we will skip chapters 14 and 15 and go to chapter 16. So I want to just introduce chapter 16 for just a little bit here. So we're going to talk about resource or factor markets here in chapter 16. And the thing about resource markets is that on the demand side, say for labor, so what are your resources, okay? We talked about earlier in the course, 4 factors of production. Do you remember what they were? Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. That was early, that's like the first chapter, and I know it's been a while, but that was like the first chapter in the book. Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And the thing about it is, those are resources. Those are the 4 broad categories of resources that are brought to bear in our economy to produce goods and services. The markets for those things have buyers and sellers, but the buyers of resources are the sellers of products, and the sellers of resources are the buyers of products. So households sell labor, say. They also can rent out capital or lease out capital. In a way, if they own a company and a company has equipment, and there's lots of different ways of discussing that. Or when it comes to land, and by that we mean natural resources, a household may, own some property that it leases out to a dairy farmer or what have you. But at any rate, it's the households that are the sellers, okay? The thing is, the demand for the resource is said to be derived. The reason people want to buy your labor in the first place, say, why would a firm want to hire you to do anything, or me to do anything? Why? It's because they're going to take your, say you're an engineer, they're going to take your input and turn it around to produce an output. So the demand for resources is said to be a derived demand. It's derived. It's different than product demands. The demand for a product kind of stands alone, but the demand for a resource is derived because the resource is used to produce a product. So your book talks here on page 323, and we can look at this together, about the demand for labor. There's a little table here where they construct the demand for labor here. This is this table 16.1. I want you to look at this for next time, think about it and so forth. And when it says unit of a resource here, this is the number of workers that your little plant may hire in the week. You may hire 1 worker, 2 workers, 3 workers. That's our resource. But to make it more general, labor is only one of the resources we talk about in this chapter. Notice here you have total output here of your resource. So we've looked at this before where you have marginal product. We've done this sort of thing before where you've calculated marginal product when you've hired successive or employed successive units of labor. You look at the output that's produced by 1 worker or 2 workers or 3 workers, and you take the change in output divided by the change in the input, labor input, and that gets you the marginal product. So there's nothing here that's new as far as that goes, okay? Now, we have observed the pattern, though. You will always see this in short-run managerial environments where managers make decisions in short run. Is you will always observe decreasing at some point. These may go up for a little bit, but eventually the marginal product always decreases. You have diminishing marginal product. That is a characteristic always present of in the short run for any production environment, say, manufacturing, what have you. So hopefully this looks familiar and you've seen this before. Now, to get the demand for labor, we include this column here. The price of the product, okay? The price of the product. Now, notice something here. For this particular plant, and this is going to change here in a minute. We're going to loosen this up. But regardless of the output that they produce, whether it's 13 chairs in a week from 2 workers or 18 chairs in a week from 3 workers, however, whatever level of product they deliver to market, they charge the same price for. So can someone tell me what's the market structure? Can you tell? This manufacturer, say, is operating in what kind of market structure? Is it monopoly? Is it perfect competition? And it's okay if you're wrong. What do y'all think? Can you make that deduction here? The price is the same, right? Price doesn't go down or anything. So it's got to be perfect competition. Got to be perfect competition. Has to be. Remember that you have a horizontal individual demand curve in perfect competition. It means regardless of the number of units you bring to the market here, so the number of resource units produces this output over here. So whatever this number is, it's not going to affect the product price. So this, we're looking at the demand for labor. Look, they've got it right here in words. For pure competition. We're going to change this up to monopoly in a minute. But this little table shows you how we get the demand for labor in a purely competitive environment. Woo! Okay? All right, so what you do is you take the product price over here. Now, if this were monopoly, you'd see these numbers going down. Because the only way you can sell more output in a monopoly is by lowering the price. But since these are all constant, man, you see it like just like this has got to be perfect or pure competition. All right, now we get this 5th column here called the total revenue. That's a new column here. Or the value of the product, if you will. All right, you take the product price and you multiply by the output. Now 2 times 0, last time I checked, is 0. Okay? But see what we're going to do as we go down here on the left. 7 units of output, which is what 1 worker will deliver. You're going to sell those $2 a piece. It's $14 in total revenue. Okay? So you might call this the value of this marginal product over here. Okay? You take the marginal product and multiply by the price. Okay, you're going to get these numbers over here, total revenue. Okay, that's kind of like the value, if you will, of the output. Not marginal, we're going to get that in a minute, not marginal output, but the output, the total output. Total 7, value $14. Total 13 output, say tables, total revenue is 26 and so forth. Because you just take these numbers and multiply by 2, you get these numbers. All right, and there's this last column. Okay, that sounded kind of wild out there. Okay, thank you. This is the last column. This is very important. This is very important. This is called the value. Well, you could call this, in this market structure, perfect competition, you could call this the value of the marginal product if you want. But we use this term in general in your books called the marginal revenue product. That's a new term. We've talked about marginal revenue. We've talked about marginal product. The marginal revenue product is the product of two things, okay? They tell you here it's basically and I think they may have made a mistake here in your text here, but it's the marginal product times the price. So I don't know why I got division here. It should be multiply. Maybe it's another way of calculating. See that 14 there? It's 7 times 2 is 14. 6 times 2 is 12. So you're taking the marginal product, just things, maybe these are tables per worker, and multiplying by the price per table, and this gives you the marginal revenue product. So for instance, let's go to one of these lines here, okay? 3 minutes here. Make sure we get the units right. But that third worker here, notice the third worker. Can y'all see that? The third worker, I'm just going to say third worker. How much would you pay for this worker? Well, notice something here. The third worker has a marginal product equal to 4. 4 tables. Say we're making tables. So this is tables per worker. Marginal product would be output per unit of input. That's marginal product. We've seen that before. Okay. The price of each table here is $2. $2 per table. Okay? Okay. So what I'm saying here, and this is just for pure competition. I'm going to generalize this in a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and multiply by price. Now, in perfect competition, there's another term for price. It's marginal revenue, right? Remember that? So I'll go ahead and generalize this. If I multiply these two things together, I get what's over here in this column. This is called the marginal revenue product. It's the product of the marginal revenue and the marginal product. Now, what would that be? Marginal revenue is $2 per table. Okay. Marginal product is 4 tables per worker. Notice, tables cancel. And you get $8 per worker. You get the value of the worker that produces this output here. The third worker is delivering $8 of value to the company in a period of time, a week or whatever it is. $8. So suppose this is a week. That's not much. I guess I should have used an hour, but let's just say a week. This third worker is delivering an additional $8 of revenue on the top line on the income statement to the company. How much would you pay for that worker? If this worker, the third worker here, is bringing in $8 in a period of time, you might pay $7 for the worker, but not $9. Okay? In fact, you begin to break even when you pay that worker $8. Okay, so you see that the third worker is worth $8 for a unit of their labor. And so what we're going to do next time, we're out of time here today, but we're going to plot the marginal revenue product that tells you the worth, if you will, for a quantity of labor. This is Q sub L, if you want, quantity of labor. In this case, that third worker, 3 workers, is worth $8. If you go back and you find out what the marginal revenue of the second worker is, it's going to be higher than that. you get a downward sloping curve here that's called the